This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Today we go back in history to discuss with two presidential scholars perhaps the greatest president of all time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and some of the worst or most forgotten gentlemen to occupy the White House. And Bill Press talks with Joe Cirincione, president of the Ploughshares Fund. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to make some unsavory political compromises to establish the New Deal. Historian Ira Katznelson tells us about that, and he calls for progressives to become more imaginative and galvanize a new New Deal. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Ira Katznelson is Columbia University's Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History. Having served as president of the American Political Science Association, he is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. He is also the author of a well-reviewed new book about the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt called Fear Itself, the New Deal, and the Origins of Our Time. Professor Katznelson, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure.
Now, in this fascinating new book, you explain that the great liberal Franklin D. Roosevelt, in effect, sold his soul to racist Southern Democrats in exchange for their support of his New Deal. Should that change the popular view of FDR as a savior of democracy?
I think what Franklin Roosevelt's relationship with Southern Democrats should do is not cause us to lose our sense that he, in fact, was a savior of democracy, and I'll return to why I think he was, but should point toward how he saved American democracy and the compromises, often deep and sometimes rotten compromises, he made to achieve that end. There were two great dangers to American democracy when Roosevelt took his oath of office on March 4th, 1933. First was the utter collapse of market capitalism. Some 25% of American wage workers were out of work, and that number is higher than it even appears because this was an era where most women were not in the wage labor force. So if a quarter of workers were out of work, that meant that well over 40% of American adults were being sustained without a wage coming into the home. And that raised questions about the capacity of democracies to answer the call of the time and solve the big problem of mass unemployment and economic collapse. And the second reason democracy was under such threat was because non-democratic regimes, those fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, all claimed to be able to solve the problems, including economic problems, that democracies like the United States could not solve. And in that competitive universe, FDR came to power, pledged to fight for American democracy and the concept of democracy, the practice of democracy, and to do so in a way that remained within the framework of democratic constitutionalism. But how he pursued that goal is the vexing issue. And one critical way in which he had to do that in dealing with Congress is to make persistent arrangements and compromises with the southern wing of the Democratic Party, which constituted more than 45% of the party in the early to mid-1930s, and more than half of the representatives in Congress who were Democrats after 1938. The president simply could not pass his legislation without the support of the southern wing of the party, and thus he found himself over and over again making compromises with their preferences.
So even though he had these huge majorities in Congress, he still had to wheel and deal, even with his own party.
That's correct. And we see an interesting example after his reelection of 1936, where he was reelected with an unprecedented majority, and not just for himself, but in bringing Democrats within Congress. He told the Congress that his highest priority was passing legislation to create a minimum wage and a 40-hour work week. And in 1937, despite those majorities, the bill did not pass. It was defeated in the House. It only passed in 1938 after significantly widened exclusions of farm workers and maids was incorporated into the bill. But in 1937, the Southerners, fearful for their racial order, bolted the party position, and Roosevelt, despite huge majorities, failed with his highest legislative priority.
We're speaking with Ira Katznelson, Columbia University's Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History, the author of Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, a new book about the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Do you agree, Professor, with the theory among historians that when FDR took over, a highly authoritarian, bureaucratic ruling class was running things all over the world, and that he was simply part and parcel of that movement?
No, I think that's too simple. When FDR was elected president, there was actually quite a diversity in who governed and who ruled. Remember that this was a period of the toppling of traditional liberal democracies, despite the hopes and expectations of that were attended on the end of the First World War, where President Wilson, amongst others, had characterized this as a war for democracy. More than 20 liberal democracies collapsed in Europe, in East Asia, in Latin America, in the 1920s and 1930s. There were very few democracies left standing by the time the Second World War began. And in that context, it would be a mistake to simply say that a ruling class was the same everywhere. There were dominant influences in the democracies as well as in the dictatorships, some of which were in common. In Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy, large-scale business power was quite important, as it was in the United States, with the following caveat. By the early 1930s, with the collapse of market capitalism, the legitimate standing of big business had eroded in the United States, so that it wouldn't be quite right to say that an economic ruling class was unchallenged and in power. And as for a bureaucratic ruling class, the United States had a rather modest size national government when Roosevelt came to power, and the government that grew under his watch grew under democratic conditions and attuned to public interest and public purposes.
Now, FDR is a giant in American history, but wasn't he seen at the beginning of his terms as somewhat of a lightweight?
By some, yes, and by others, no. He, after all, had worked in Washington during the Wilson years as an assistant secretary of the Navy. He'd also been quite effective as governor of New York. But he had been a modest student at Harvard. He was, when he was an undergraduate, in the early years of the century, he was not seen as an intellectual. He wasn't an intellectual. He didn't immerse himself as a policy wonk might in the details of public policy. But I think many people saw him and understood that he was a political leader of some capability in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of his ability to mobilize people, and in his ability to put together political coalitions. So he was dismissed by some, including at one point Walter Lippmann, the leading journalist in America, as not quite ready for prime time in the presidency, but others thought he was, and indeed he proved to be.
Do you think Congress went along with the massive new social programs because they were concerned Roosevelt might impose them by fiat and thus weaken American democracy?
That's a good question, but I don't think so. That's quite right. There was the option that was in the air at the time, and that was articulated even by President Roosevelt as a possibility at the end of his first inaugural address, of the president and the presidency gaining uncommon executive power to face up to the emergency. But those powers were never asked for by the president and never achieved. I think the principal reasons that Congress went along with massive new social programs is because they were desperately, desperately needed under the conditions of mass unemployment and economic collapse. And these programs were supported largely across the board by certainly almost all Democrats at the time, irrespective of whether they represented the North, the West, the Midwest, or the American South. And Southerners, too, supported these programs. They came from a dirt-poor region, but they did so always with a caveat that the Jim Crow system of segregation would be protected as they supported these new social programs.
And before we let you go, Professor, is the New Deal dead? Is it time for progressives to lay it aside and create new domestic paradigms?
Well, there's no way to simply reproduce the New Deal today. The circumstances are different. The legislative possibilities are different. But the country desperately needs a new progressive imagination, whether in dealing with the deepening inequality in the country, dealing with the persistence of structural and hardcore unemployment, in dealing with fiscal issues, in dealing with a host, a variety of social questions. We need the spirit of experimentation that was found in the New Deal, and we, above all, need the capacity to galvanize a majority coalition, both in the population and in Congress, in support of progressivism appropriate for the 21st century. A new New Deal, if you like.
The name of the book, Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time. This is a book about the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the author, Ira Katznelson, Columbia University's Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
It's been a treat to talk to you.
Thank you again. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going, and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Another presidential historian, Michael Gerhardt, has written a book about forgotten presidents. And in just a minute, we're going to find out who were the worst. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Basketball Hall of Famer Charles Barkley says, "I was a Republican until they lost their minds." Welcome to North Carolina, where the governor's office, the state senate, and the state house have been turned into loony bins of Republican screwballism. We know from the not-too-distant past that it actually is possible to be both sane and a Republican. But don't go looking for that combo in the Capitol complex of the Tar Heel state. Far right-wing zealots have seized complete control of the government, and yahoo! What a clown show they're putting on. Any program that helps the middle class or the poor, whack it. Any scheme that further enriches and empowers corporate plutocrats, enact it. Any rule or normal procedure that's in the way of their zaniness, run over it. In July, for example, the rampaging ideologues decided it would be a hoot to punch women in the face with a new law taking away their reproductive rights and nearly all of their health clinics. But running such a divisive and unpopular policy shift through the legislative process can get very messy, for women and many men would rebel, protest, and make a fuss. But hey, shouted the clowns, people can't make a fuss if they don't know we're doing it to them. So bam! Without any notice, much less public hearings, senators grabbed a silly bill dealing with the right-wing bugaboo of Sharia law, tacked their repressive abortion agenda to it, and rammed it through in 18 hours. Then, the wacky boys in the House grabbed, of all things, a motorcycle safety bill and piled the abortion stuff onto it, again, without any public notice or public participation. They even called it a safety bill. What fun! This is Jim Hightower saying, less fun, though, for those buffoons, is that they're now being confronted all around the state by protesters wearing motorcycle helmets.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Americans may argue over who was the greatest U.S. president, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, but oh, how little attention we pay to the least among them. Presidential historian Michael Gerhardt reviews for us the subject of his new book, The Forgotten Presidents. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Michael Gerhardt is a professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government. He is one of the nation's leading experts on constitutional law and the author of a fascinating new book called The Forgotten Presidents, Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. Michael Gerhardt, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. There are so many best-selling biographies of presidents, Lincoln, Truman, Adams, LBJ. Why did you write this book about the nondescript occupants of the White House?
Well, maybe because they were not on that list you just gave. There are a number of presidents who served and just are given less attention for one reason or another. The issue is not so much whether they're as eminent, let's say, as somebody is like President Lincoln, or as maybe great as he might have been, but rather just that they had a constitutional impact that people have yet to really know more about or understand.
Why are they? I mean, why are they forgotten? Is it that they did something bad, something good? Did they follow the wrong person? I mean,
it may not just be one factor. There may be different factors or combination of factors that explain why much of these presidents have been forgotten by most Americans. I think among the things you mentioned are some of the reasons. If you're sandwiched between two fairly large personalities or dramatic events or sort of very colorful characters, you might get lost in the middle. If you didn't have something dramatic happen during your presidency, like a huge war, that might be a factor. If you died in office early, that could be another factor. So there are just different reasons why these presidents have receded out of people's minds.
So can you be a good president and still be forgotten?
I think so. And part of the point of the book is not to rate presidents. I'm not trying to say these are great or good or presidents. I'm not even necessarily saying they're all bad. So I'm not making that judgment.
Right.
But you can, I think, be a good or a successful president and not be remembered much at all. I think the classic example, maybe the best example of that, is from the University of North Carolina graduate, James Polk, who served one term but actually achieved every one of his campaign pledges and is often regarded as most historians as one of the most successful one-term presidents in history.
Wow. Now, I just that's a name you never think about. You recognize them, of course, because at some time you had to learn them all, but
right.
You kind of forget about their histories.
Right, and Polk. It's not as if Polk's presidency was uneventful. There were a number of important things that happened. One of which was the war against Mexico, the Mexican War, which became very famous for being one of the first times in history, maybe the first time in American history, where we didn't wait to be attacked. We made a preemptive strike against Mexico, which ultimately culminated in our getting Texas. But it's a history that maybe some people know, but a lot of people either forgot after they learned it in high school.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Michael Gerhardt, who is a professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government, and also the author of the book The Forgotten Presidents, Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. So who is the most forgotten of the presidents?
I think it's pretty clear that Millard Fillmore is the most forgotten American president. He followed Zachary Taylor, who died in office, so the fact that Taylor died gave him a little more notoriety. Fillmore completed his term, but because he wasn't elected in his own right, that made him a little less popular, maybe even a little less known. And he then did not follow, didn't have a term after he finished Taylor's term, so he was only in office roughly 2 years. And they were eventful years, but he was a fairly colorless character himself, not a great speaker. And therefore was maybe just less notable over the long term. And I think lastly, he positioned himself in some respects on the wrong side of history, the losing side of history, by defending the Fugitive Slave Act, and that may have hurt his legacy as well.
Mm-hmm. Why do you list Taft as a forgotten president? He's the progenitor of a very famous family of politicians, served on the Supreme Court. Things were named after him, well, some things anyway. I mean,
right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I think he may be known, but he's probably not known for what he did as president. He may be known as sort of the answer to a trivia question, and that is which president also was Chief Justice. That's William Howard Taft. It's quite an accomplishment. But then people may know more about what he did as Chief Justice than as president. So part of the point of that chapter is to sort of bring out the very busy 4 years he spent as president. Most of the accomplishments of which people just don't know. And I think it shows that he had more of an impact as president on the Constitution than most people might have assumed.
Well, and I guess it's fair to say that you're going to be on the Supreme Court longer. You're dealing with a lot more different issues, certainly, than perhaps anyway, than as the president, so that would make sense. Looking at modern day, say the most of forgotten or not to be forgotten, say the last 4 or 5 presidencies, where do you put these? Are these all going to be memorable presidents, you think?
I think most of them are going to be memorable for one reason or another. I think probably the most forgotten of the more recent presidencies, for better or worse, is that of Jimmy Carter. It's partly because he was sandwiched between the Watergate crisis on the one hand and the presidency of Ronald Reagan on the other. He was also sort of dismissed as a sort of a failure because he got trounced by Reagan in Carter's re-election campaign. And he was a pretty bad speaker, which didn't help, and he's had a long run as ex-president. All those things helped diminish his presidency, but he actually had a very active presidency. He got most of the legislation through that he wanted to get achieved in Congress, which is something, but we tend not to know about the actual impact he had on the Constitution, and that's what I write about in the chapter.
I was going to guess Gerald Ford, but as soon as you brought up Carter and you made the points of it, I thought, okay, that's fair.
No, Ford, I mean, I should say that many presidents, even perhaps some that I don't talk about in the book, are actually probably forgotten as well. It's a relative thing.
Right.
And it may be that there are more than 13 presidents that are forgotten, which is maybe a sad comment on knowledge about American history. But Ford, I think, because he's part of that Watergate period and was thought to be an antidote to Richard Nixon and made efforts to sort of root out the corruption and really bring good government back into being after Nixon resigned, it does get a little more notoriety than I think Carter does. So anytime anybody talks about Watergate, you got to talk about Gerald Ford.
Yeah, I was going to try and say, and from a parody standpoint too, who was on SNL more often. And I think it's probably even. Chevy Chase is Gerald Ford, and Dan Aykroyd is as Jimmy Carter. So that's probably a split there.
To the extent people remember that, yes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's my political history. I'm remembering SNL. Michael Gerhardt, professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government. The book, The Forgotten Presidents, Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Ploughshares Fund President Joe Cirincione.
Good to have you with us. So what a team we've got in studio. Chris Kofinas has been here and continues as a friend of Bill, Democratic strategist, and another longtime friend of Bill in the programs. Joe Cirincione, head of the Ploughshares Fund, in studio with us. Chris, thanks for being here. And Joe, welcome back.
My pleasure.
You've been off bouncing around the world, as always. Yeah, keeping us on track.
I'm back here to enjoy August in D.C. A great time to be in the city.
Because it's a ghost town and you can get around, right?
The best part of D.C. is when everyone's gone.
Isn't it great when everybody leaves, right?
Beltway traffic? What Beltway traffic?
What Beltway? So let's start with the summit. The president yesterday... and we've been asking Jay Carney for some time. He's not happy about Snowden. What if they do this? Will there still be a summit? The White House kept saying, we have no plans, no announcement to make, no change in plans. Well, now we know the change in plans. And the president's saying, I'm not coming to that summit. I'm going to go to Sweden instead.
Yeah.
Is he making the right move?
Yeah, well, this is, I think he is, but there's problems here. This is one of those on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, I can't believe he let Snowden screw up one of the major relationships we have in the world. I think it's a little inappropriate for the President of the United States to throw a hissy fit over one whistleblower who's been granted temporary asylum, the kind of thing that we would do if Snowden were Russian and had come here. We wouldn't be kicking him out and turning him back to the country. So that's the inappropriate part. On the other hand, underneath that, the fact is that the U.S.-Russian relationship is at a standstill. There isn't anything to agree on. When you go to a summit, you like to have the presidents announce something, some kind of agreement. There were no prospects that Russia and the United States were going to be able to announce anything. As the New York Times editorialized a couple of days ago, it only would have added to Putin's domestic prestige. You would give him this world stage to puff himself up on. So, and Putin's been kind of an
inappropriate individual.
Inappropriate individual.
We all know the word you want to use.
I can say it in Greek if you like.
Well, and so on all these issues, on Syria, remember there was going to be a U.S.-Russian peace conference. Well, not anymore. He's pulled the plug. He's just backing with Assad. Syria's in stalemate, and Russia's not helping. On nuclear reductions, the president wants to cut nuclear weapons. Putin won't agree. He's been adding all kinds of conditions to that. We're a little closer on Iran and North Korea, a couple of other issues, but overall there was nothing to agree to. So the key here is, okay, the summit's off, but don't let this important work stop. Great powers find a way to work through their disagreements and do the business we have to do. Most importantly, resuscitating the nuclear reduction process, getting rid of these Cold War arsenals.
Chris, it also looks like there's another factor here, right? Is the two of these guys don't like each other.
Oh, they clearly don't like each other.
I mean, the pictures.
The body language. I mean, you can tell when they everyone remembers the images of Yeltsin and Clinton. They genuinely liked each other.
Yeah.
So I think this it's personal, but it's also stylistic. And the differences they have on policy are just, are pretty profound. I mean, this has been building for years, as everyone remembers. When Secretary Clinton came in, announced this reset. The problem is it's tough to reset, I think, with Russia and Putin in particular, who basically have a different vision of what Russia's role should be, both in the region and internationally.
Yeah.
And you see that playing out. Perfect example in Syria right now. You could not see a more dramatic, gulf between two major powers than in that place.
Yeah. Now, I got to tell you, my take on it, I think it looks pretty petty on the president's part.
Yes.
And it was reinforced to me, again, New York Times this morning points out that the president, by making this decision, potentially dooming his aspirations for further nuclear arms cuts before leaving office. That, to me, is so important for this country, for the planet, and for the president's legacy, that he's going to let this pipsqueak Edward Snowden derail that possibility?
Right.
I mean, come on. They're placing too much importance, I believe, on Snowden.
I'm with you on that part of it. There's no question. And weeks ago, I heard that Snowden was taking up all the oxygen in the room, and that all talks of nuclear reductions, Syria, other issues, had just been pushed aside by this one guy.
Missile defense, trade, Syria, Iran,
North
down
Korea,
the list,
human rights,
of all those things, human rights, human rights, so that are all being basic. And we're not going to talk about any of that because we're pissed off about Snowden.
Yeah. So I'm. This is a tough call. I'm totally sympathetic with that, and I think they let this get out of control. Underneath it, however, is the reality that Putin was not about to agree to anything independent of Snowden. And so maybe, maybe
might have been a waste.
If you play this well, if you deny him the thing he wants, which is the summit with the leader of the greatest nation on earth, you deny him that, can you still work it so that you get some agreement? That makes Friday's meeting here in town all the more important. Hagel and Kerry are meeting with their Russian counterparts. Can we get some business done there?
Maybe we could get a nuclear arms treaty with Sweden, though, Chris, out of this.
We could. Now, if the Swedes start developing nuclear weapons, we're all in real trouble. I think the president was in a difficult spot. I think the challenge there is, you play it out. They have the summit. Right. What's one of the you're absolutely right about the announcing that's always a key part of the summit. What are you going to announce? You could probably make something up, but then the thing to me that would have been most significant is then you have that press conference where both both leaders are going to sit there and get asked really tough questions. The president at that moment has to be very tough on Putin and publicly. That is and Putin will come right back. That creates a real spectacle. Mm-hmm. That I think is almost unavoidable in my mind, and
might have been worth going to Moscow.
And might have been
in order to make the statement.
I agree,
there.
and I think if you wanted to really push his buttons, Putin's buttons, that may have been the tack that I would have advised: is go there and punch him.
And the reaction from the Democratic opponents in Moscow is actually split along these lines. There was some, like Garry Kasparov, the chess master, who welcomes it, who says, "Good, stand up to this guy. Don't kowtow to him." And there are others who say he should have come and met with us. So again,
let me switch gears just in the interest of time, which to this. We're still in the middle of this terror threat that was announced in the Middle East.
Yes.
Our 19 embassies are still closed.
Yes.
What do we know about it? Yemen now says we just busted up the plot that they planned. So it was real, and we busted it up.
Suspicions are growing that more is being made of these intelligence intercepts that might be warranted. We still don't have any details on where exactly the threat was supposed to be, what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to happen last Sunday. It's all based on intercepted intelligence between the head of Al-Qaeda, who's now in Pakistan, al-Zawahiri, and the head of Al-Qaeda
Arabian Peninsula,
al-Wuhasi. A relatively new leader and young and untested leader of this group. We've been killing the previous leaders of AQAP.
Yeah, that's right.
And I got to tell you, I was scrolling some of the jihadist websites, the ones that get translated, and they're jubilant about this. They're bragging about how the U.S. is wasting billions of dollars in this, and we'd like to see more of these, whether or not there are actual jihadist operations planned, they say. So it could be an overreaction by the United States. It could be an effort to justify the NSA intelligence gathering operations that have become very controversial. It may be just the unexpected overreaction to what happened in Benghazi with the killing of our ambassador and others.
You talk about this is another tough call, isn't it, Chris?
Oh, yeah.
What do you do?
What I'm curious about
do you ignore it or do you take action?
What I'm curious about is where I read about the reports of a conference call. Was that true? I mean, is the intelligence on that fairly accurate?
Well, part of the problem we have is they're not really telling us what they know, and they leak it a little bit. The most complete story I've seen is in the New York Times, and they talk about intercepted communications. I didn't see whether that was verbal or written.
All right, but you just said something I found very curious, which is that you've been scrolling these jihadist websites.
Yeah.
Dude,
don't you? I mean,
have you learned nothing?
NSA. Whoa.
I think that's
you know what list your name is
there
on.
There goes my security clearance.
I believe there's a rendition squad waiting for him outside.
I mean, seriously, that's you can get a little
light reading.
A little light reading, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, any such connection gets you automatically, doesn't it, on the list? Officer, I was just doing my research.
Just make sure you clear your cookies.
I'm an academic. Clear my cookies. That's right. So this does set us back, and it also runs counter to the administration's message. They've been telling us Al Qaeda's been decimated.
I was just going to ask you that next, right?
And they've taken care of this, and we've won the war on winning the war on terrorism.
No, I have
here
heard
we
that.
are.
We've got Al Qaeda. They're on the run, and now they're on the rise. So are they on the run or on the rise?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But we will be back with Joe Cirincione, and wait till you hear, and Chris Kofinas, and wait till you hear how the Japanese plan to solve the problems at the Fukushima nuclear plant. Very creative, you must say.
Japan, radioactivity, gigantic construction projects. It's got everything.
Here's a little hint, Godzilla.
Come back.
Follow us on Twitter @BP Show. This is The Bill Press Show. This is The Bill Press Show.
Yes, indeed. 13 minutes before the top of the hour here in studio with us, Joe Cirincione from the Ploughshares Fund and Chris Kofinas, Democratic strategist, a friend of Bill, talking about the delayed summit, talking about the situation in Yemen. With those 19 embassies still closed until the end of the week. I want to move on to Fukushima here, Joe. But first, Ken is calling from San Rafael, California. Hello. That's on the way to Inverness, by the way, San Rafael. Hi, Ken.
Absolutely.
Good morning.
Good morning, Bill. I think it's a big mistake not meeting with Putin. I mean, every time you have a chance to talk with either an adversary or a friend that you don't like, you make progress, even if it's very little progress. And it looks childish almost if you don't go. It looks, I'm afraid to go. And the whole thing about Stone is so ridiculous. I mean, there are no secrets this guy can give up that's going to make any difference in America's security. Let's get real.
All right, we got it, Ken. I think it's a reaction of a lot of people.
Good point, especially for an administration that said it was going to come in willing to talk to anybody, anywhere. And now we're not really talking to our adversaries. We're not talking to Iran. We're not talking to North Korea. We're not even talking to our former partner, Putin. It doesn't look good.
I mean, yeah, it's a response to a point you made earlier that we have made progress on these areas where you're certainly not going to make any progress unless you're trying, right? Or talking. It
so
seems
he's going to have to rescue us. I kind of understand the move, as I said, but he's going to have to rescue us, work harder at the lower official level.
He's going to come up with a big trade deal with Sweden. I'm telling you guys. I don't know what Sweden's got that we want, but we're going to get it.
It's a nice place to visit.
Stockholm is beautiful.
Stockholm is beautiful.
I mean, if you were in Holland, I could say tulips. I don't know what we get out of Sweden. Cheese?
I mean,
the Swedes.
Let's just stop right there.
My email.
Let's not back.
I'm going to back off. All right. I love Sweden. Here's a headline.
By the way, current TV is huge in Sweden, so let's be careful, okay?
Well, it's going to be bigger there than it is here in about a week. Headline, New York Times. Japan stepping in to help clean up of atomic plant. I thought they had cleaned this place up, and what's going on now?
Fukushima is a continuing slow-motion catastrophe. It's not over yet. Remember, these are the reactors that melted down, down and shut down the electricity. Thousands of people killed as part of what happened in the wake of the tsunami a couple of years ago. Well, they've been unable to contain the radioactive water that is still continues to pour out of the plant. They have to keep pouring water on these melted cores so that they don't go critical.
Yeah.
But there's no containment walls anymore, so they pump the water in and the water just seeps out.
And the water seeps out, and it's now radioactive.
And they're building pools to hold it, but they have hundreds of tons of water that they're generating every day, and they're just acknowledged. They just acknowledged that tons of this radioactive water is going into the Pacific Ocean every day. So there's nothing funny about radioactivity except when there is. And this,
I remember a couple of good jokes from college about radioactivity.
Yeah, and three-eyed fish on The Simpsons. But here, this is their latest plan. These guys are desperate. They are going to build the world's largest ice wall to contain it. They've decided they're going to freeze the ground around the entire plant. The wall will extend for a mile in length all the way around the facility and go 100 feet down. And that's the way they will contain the radioactive water.
A brilliant idea.
But this is not the North Pole. First of all, you couldn't even do it there now with global warming. But how are they going to keep this damn wall frozen?
Well, they're going to have to use electricity that's being generated from the Fukushima disabled nuclear power plant. What could possibly go wrong?
In all fairness, what are you talking about? It's easy. How do you keep... Do you not all have ice in your home? Right? How do you keep ice cold in your home? They're going to build the world's biggest refrigerator around the ice, which is around...
And every day the Japanese people will come and bring ice to the wall.
By the way, can someone cue the Godzilla
feet
monster?
down. This is before everybody says, "Oh, look at these guys! They're making this stuff up." We're not making this up, right?
No. You can't make this up. You can't make this up. This is not Game of Thrones. It's actually Japan wants to build a giant wall, a giant wall of ice.
Is this going to be like small ice cubes or big ice cubes?
This is go to the New York Times. It's in the end of their front page story on here and it just shows you how desperate it is, how dangerous nuclear power is. You know, something goes wrong at a coal plant or a solar plant, hey, it's a problem. Something goes wrong at a nuclear power plant, it's a catastrophe, and it doesn't end quickly.
But the comforting line is the last one in the New York Times article about this morning. Officials say that no wall of ice on such a scale has ever been attempted before.
I mean... that technically is true.
You got to remind them.
Right.
Let's go. They're desperate. They're trying something that's never been built. If not this, it's definitely going to be giant robot monsters.
That's next.
That's next.
I mean, Putin and Obama should meet to talk about the wall of ice between them.
I think exactly. I think there's a wall of ice between them.
Thank God for August.
That's it. We got it covered here. Chris Kofinas, thank you, man. Thanks for coming in. All right.
Give me a current cup,
we still want to know what you said in Greek at the top of the hour. He was cursing in Greek at the top of the hour. Joe Cirincione, always good to have you in, my friend.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Joe.
Ploughshares.org.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ira Katznelson, Michael Gerhardt, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org